I have two books that I'm talking about, so maybe I will let you look at them. I've got random post-its. When I get to 2 minutes, will you let me know? And how does this work? I go like that? Oh, yes. Awesome. So just go. So I will know to jump. So I called this From the Way to the Page. This talk asks whether the relationship between poet and translator can, or must in the case of sound and certain visual poetries, be compared with that of composer and performer. A key here word might be interpreter, both in the sense that came up yesterday in the nudies talk, but also as the interpreter of a play, a poem, a piece of music. In other words, the interpreter is here the one who, in the French sense of the term représentation, meaning to put on or perform, uses their body to bring the text into voice. The reading of the page as score involves the interpretation and reinterpretation of the use by authors of visual signs, erasures, font, invented languages, punctuation, handwritten annotations, even poster-sized pages and typographical gestures as graphic representation of breath and sound, or, more extremely, figurative forms on the page, semantic elements that are often extralingual. These are fundamental components of what, and more specifically how, visual poems are meant to be heard, read, seen, experienced. Parallels may be drawn between these pages and contemporary music scores of Boulez. One of the most significant questions that translators face, especially translators of poetry, is that of, shall I make it new in my native language, or remake it anew? Poetry itself naturally subverts codified linguistic codes, standardized uses of language as basic communicative force, placing the nature and purpose of language itself into question. When it comes to visual and sound poetry, translation, there's some random pages, already takes place in the on to off the page experience of the work, in the reading by the eye or voice, where topography, visual signs, the white space, even drawn marks, arrows, lines, and forms join more traditional linguistic components of poetic form. For surrealist scholar Francois Caradec, such exploration sought a new form of reading, one which was destabilizing for the uninitiated reader. Authors of the early 20th century literary groups that were performing visual phonic and often multilingual texts in public spaces composed works like musical scores, using volume and speed indications on pages where multiple lines of text were read simultaneously, like one might see on a sheet of music for a quartet, with bars of music set one atop the other, in order that they be followed along by all players as each part is played by its destined instrument. Such multi-voice text, like this very familiar one, right, were composed to be performed aloud by multiple speakers, making a rendition by any single reader impossible. Many such texts have been deemed untranslatable because of their very nature, already being multilingual, much like their counterpart texts which use neologistic or nonsense-based sound vocabularies like carabane or Zaun poetry. But of course, one might argue that the translator of works like La Murale cherche une maison à louer could just scramble the translations. For example, making an English, French, Italian, German text, German, English, French, Italian, like Moray presented to us yesterday in her English, French of what was originally a Portuguese, Spanish text. This is thus translation not as interpretation, as much as one might see it as variation, like when here's a variation on a piece of music. These explorations of multiple voices, sound without or beyond meaning, and multilingualism, combined with the visual page explorations of Mallarmé and Apollinaire, have given way to what I am tentatively classifying as 3 categories of visual poetry, which relate to 3 specific limitations on interpreters, performers, and or translators. And I'm mostly going to focus on category 1. Poetry whose visuality serves the oral interpretation, doubles it, or is a score for a reading. Such source texts use only one or more legible language, typography, etc. These works have a clear eye-ear interconnectivity, or in some cases, these works have no evident typographical scoring, but the author has chosen to annotate the text as one might note crescendo, pianissimo, on a sheet of music, designating the method that one should play or hear, thus interpret the poem. Category 2, poetry whose visuality resists performance, whose oral interpretation will be reductive of the work. Such works might include, oops, not there, Such works might include simultaneous uses of typography, visual scoring, inserted extralingual signs in multiple languages that inherently challenge linearity, inviting multiple directions for reading. This one does that. They thus trouble the eye-ear connections or even block them from one end of the connection or the other. Such works tend to use collage, erasure, color to highlight speakers or delineate forms of writing within a single text. In these works, legibility might be questionable in a near extinct state, but is still fundamentally present. The third category, which I am not going to discuss at all, are poetic works which defy both oral and visual interpretation or reading. This category would include certain ascetic writings or word art. My focus today is primarily on category 1, though perhaps we might ask the question posed by Jean-Pierre Bourbiot, whether it is even possible to take stock of the difference in articulation manifested by or between graphic and phonic signifier, meaning my whole talk would be flawed. So category 1, poetry as partition, music score, where sound is poetic meaning, the page serves to make poem music. In these poems, the typography, that's example, little bit of last page, the things I'm passing around are these. In these poems, the typography, its size, form, placement, functions as a kind of extralingual element that the reader and later a translator might echo. Following the futurist Marinini's truly tossing words into liberty, authors from the Dadaist movement, such as Paul van Ostegen, in his letter to Jos Leonard, justifies his own typography choices as rhythmic, speaking of his poem, Bezet Stade. Such ideas come from his French predecessor, Mallarmé, who demonstrated in Un coup de dé that typography is, quote, demonstrably the most apt tool to suggest sonorities, intonations, the word itself. Ferdinand Baudin argues that the Dadaists were not really using typography at all, but rather a kind of Dada a-typography, like asyntaxicness or agrammaticalness, combined with a mise-en-page that echoes the author's or the work's personality. For Baudin, such poems fail to subvert, actually, the rules of typography or page layout. Instead, they subject the works to even greater adherence to linguistic, semantic, and semiotic rules. As Karadak put it, Dada wanted to shock by employing to their extreme limits the traditional laws of typography. In these works, standard single-size fonts are replaced by gradations that correspond to volume or attention, often based on extremely precise demands by the authors. As one can see on this minimalistic page by Bernard Eitzig, abundant uses of white, specific physical placement of letters, signs, and words on the page or pages of such texts in the end, argues Baudin, lead to a system emerging which is not addressing itself to the eye, but rather to the spirit. To return to the Mallarméian thought on this, it is a prismatic subdivision of the idea, a precise spiritual mise-en-scène, where syntax is not suppressed or removed, but reinforced. But when those works are passing, reinforced thus, tac, 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 dans les siècles de siècles, we hear and feel time in that slowness on the page. But when these works are passed into a new language, the translator must subject the work to his or her own reading resounding and attempt to relocate an equivalent prismatic feeling that was felt in the original language. This pretty standard process of translating parallels that of the performer reader. Returning to the aforementioned example of Ostegen's Bezet Stade, Baudin argues that it is not only a poem, but a book, and that a book is to poetry what a score is to music. Both book and score are, in the end, secondary. Thus, the book is only a means, just as the poetry is neither more than less than the word. And that initial biblical word for him, or verb, was not the word written down, inscribed, but that which is spoken, said, heard, pronounced. This early concept is one that Heitzig subscribed to wholeheartedly. As he stated in his July 2008 preface to the 1955 section of his retrospective collection, Poème Partition, which is this giant thing I'm passing around, poem scores, his own text, poems disposed over the page or pages, are just like music sheets. There's some coming up on that one. For performers, supplying him with rhythms, intensities, speed, ruptures, and silences that would only exist in full once the poems were said aloud, publicly, or else retransmitted by some other auditory format, such as on vinyl or CD. That tells you a little bit about his date. He talks about getting a particular recorder, a magnetophone in 1970 that was the newest thing. If he only could have lived another century, right? Heitzig stated, voila, what we must do is project words into space without falling into, evidently, merely making music. So, how is this work different from music? I'd argue first that it does not expect the voice to sing, but rather to vocalize. And for many poet performers, it also implies a specific use of the body to articulate the work. Thus, Heitzig's coined term, action poetry from 1962. As for him, these scores were to bring the poem into action, the body activating the page, and of course this implies a dynamic, an animation of the page in space, via voice, body, breath, etc. As his counterpart, contemporary sound and visual poet Julien Blend says of his own collection of partitions, or scores, which are, by the way, in his case, less poems that are scores to be read and more notes after the fact regarding performances of text-based works. Blaine says of his performed text, perf is the poem in flesh and bone, and bod and cry, in the sense of to cry out, and bod as in body. He says cor, C-O-R instead of C-O-R-P-S, this kind of slang-ish thing. Blaine is developing poetry by physical enactment and articulation, as well as voice, taking up the mantle with the new generation of happenings and action poetry, lifting poetry off the page so that others must confront it, quote, putting them face to face with poetry in flesh and blood and cry. Rooted as such explorations are in a kind of marriage between Mallarméan ideas and those of Zaum, as well as other Dadaist or Surrealist phonic poem explorations, many action and sound poems are strongly reliant on onomatopoeia, or sound slippages that relate to homonymic play. Many extend a single vowel or consonant sound, much like one might hold a note, through the use of breath and body. The way words are embodied are different. Frequently criticized, sound poetry has been seen as reductive in meaning, simplistic, even relegated to a statute of pseudo-theater instead of poetry, or as serving only an overtly playful purpose. The work, however, of a century of explorations by authors from around the globe would tend to negate such criticism and demand a closer look at what such page orality is really achieving. Much of the work is highly political, like Heitzig's most famous performance poem, which I encourage you to experience online. It's too long, or I would have played it. It's the one that's Autour de Vaudouze, or Pour de Vaudouze. It's all about what everybody's around what causes war, right? A single war that causes this little teeny town. And this repetition of voices, it's great. You can YouTube it. So there's a real serious matter in what is also very playful sound. I also think of Lily Robert Foley's Alien Responses from yesterday, how those sound pieces animated the connectedness and disconnectedness between the elements of words, re-breaking them down so that their familiar attachments for us to meaning were temporarily displaced, much as one sees in this poem by Heitzig. From a series of 6 poems after paintings by Tapies, sidebar. There are lots and lots of these oral poems that are about paintings. It's we could have a whole moment on that. Future conference. Here, the physical force of the artist, the effort to engrave, perhaps even the slow emergence of the work, of Tapies's work, are embodied in the physical and visual forms of the words attempting to engrave themselves on this page. From the verb graver, to engrave, varying from word parallels with gravel to gray to scratches and scratch, which has a happy parallel in French, which is griffer, which is close to graver. Both sound and eye are provoked by this work. And one might even argue that performed alone, one might be slow to take in the nuances at play between words forming, unforming, and homonymic play here. So both the eye and ear are at exciting work together. A parallel can be noted in these pages by Jacques Simon, which some of you have already seen from this fall, because it's my current obsession, where Simon, unlike Heitzig, uses font size to hierarchize, and here's the second page of this, hierarchize, does this have the void? Maybe I skipped a void. Well, hierarchize information so that a void which emerges after some of these pages, there it is, void, containing you, as in the vous, voice, voix, path, voix, and an Italian version of you, void, leaps off the page, flies in fact like the VVs, which we see more in the next page of this, because this goes on lots and lots, VVs, which come together almost like bird wings. This kind of practice is extremely common in the kind of works that I place into the category 1, where letter size often indicates reading volume, while also, as seen in the following poem, Chute, existing as dramatic visual, being as a dramatic visual, being visually bold, right? Here, Blaine's poem is accompanied by images from performance art shows of it. Explaining his work, Blaine speaks of a curious sort of reversal process than the one expressed by Heidsieck. He states, "I do exhibitions to publish books. Books, not catalogs. The book in space gives the book in the book. And after I can read the book. Read it with all of my body, in flesh and blood." In this kind of reading, which Blaine calls an interpretation, we're seeing here, he hopes to not just be in the mechanical representation, automatically linking the cause, what he calls the cause, which he says is the text, to the effect, which he says is the reading. Instead, he desires something more dramatic, something out of body, out of flesh. Given this, many of his performances combine elements suggested on the page with elements he adds, from instruments to breath to physical movements. In shute, literally meaning to fall, a fall meaning shoot, thus containing within that homonym shoot, which means shh or shut up, thus fall shush or slip shh, if one might attempt to render the sound play in a translation. Visually, this apparently simple poem is quite intriguing. It was a homage to Yves Klein and Joachim Pfeffer. Blaine explains that it is a play from verb to onomatopoeia, body to voice, gesture to speech, simulacra to risk, or even risk of failed simulacra, thus a real fall. The text both approaches and runs away from us. Oh, really? The rhetorically spray painted with missing pieces fall recalls graffiti, and the ellipses awaits what exactly? A drug, as in the other sound of chuter in French, which is a homonym of shooting up, or our own fall. But then the poem ends on a hard close with the shoot in parentheses, thus parentheses, quotation marks, thus clearly enunciated in a font which is bold and complete and as certain as the implied critique of noise. It snaps the poem shut, much as, when it finally happens, after one is worried one might actually slips and falls. The sound of shoot, evoking to this Anglophone reader, of course, shit, felt in the dramatic moment before the pain begins radiating. But one can also look at it in reverse. The shoot in the foreground, with the shoots fading away, as if falling away, growing dimmer and quieter, like the reversed rungs of a ladder, or this staircase, which is in the other photo. He's a Marseille poet, so Marseille, right? Given Blaine's focus on body and performance as completing the page, he includes in his book of partitions poems which are in themselves very visually normative as well, such as this. But then with this normativeness, he accompanies it with sort of these red and blue, black tell us how he's going to read it, and that at the end he will end up asphyxiated. And if he does this poem and he's sticking his tongue out and it's getting in the way, and so he can't really breathe. So some of these poems, we wouldn't know to translate them or read them that way. But he's given us his own partitions for how he wants them to be performed, which is extralingual. I will obviously say nothing about category 2. I will just conclude by saying category 2, which I would have said I've shown you a couple images of, just basically talks about the multiplicity of directions you can read and how things get troubled by that. We can't see them, but I wanted to end with a little image by Susan Howe. So to conclude, one of the most surprising readings I ever experienced was by Susan Howe at the Pompidou Center in Paris, reading in front of white and white paintings by Agnes Martin, with whom she had shared an art studio in her youth. As Howe came to the close of her reading of this poem, I expected, which is from Souls of the Labadee tract, I expected her to end on the final visible word, God, on page 124. Perhaps then to pause, to hold us in a lengthy silence, but instead, the eroded language on page 125, where there are no longer words at all, but merely the remnants of words that have come to form a single vertical line, and even that is petering away at the top and bottom, thinning, that non-linguistic sign was read aloud, as a very loud and vibrating which really surprised me from Susan Howe. Its emergence from Howe startled me. But it has continued to haunt me because what I had seen as the erasure of form of language, I thought of as legible, the sound which I expected to be relegated to silence had been translated into volume. And I realized, as a translator seeing an error in a familiar text that they had completed years ago, that I had in fact reversed my translation of this visible space. This finds its echo in the often-reclaimed celebration of logic and poetry, for, as Bonin notes, logic marks an eruption of thought in the domain of contemplation and ecstasy, which is that of the poet. So, thank you.
Thank you to all three speakers. I'm afraid we started a little late as it is Friday morning and people